Gregg got a citation for his porch light because his neighbor Janet claimed it was harassing her from across the street. She wasn't just a complainer, she was a self-appointed enforcer with a clipboard and a thirst for a control. But Gregg had one brilliant idea and two stadium floodlights that flipped the whole situation. And just wait until you see how the HOA finally took her down and restored peace to the cul-de-sac. Gregg Mallory wasn't the type to make waves. After years of saving, he and his wife Lisa had finally moved into a quiet neighborhood just outside Springfield, Missouri. Their new home sat on a peaceful cul-de-sac, the kind with trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and folks who waved but rarely stopped to talk. It was supposed to be a soft landing. Gregg worked the graveyard shift at a shipping warehouse, and Lisa cared for his aging black lab, Scout, who'd started having trouble with stairs and night vision. So Gregg installed a single porch light, low wattage, motion activated, barely brighter than a candle, and thought nothing of it. Then came the letter, folded 3 times, printed on pastel stationery with cursive headings, and slipped under their front door like some kind of suburban summons. It wasn't from the HOA board, at least not officially. It was signed in long, elegant loops by one Janet Dillard, who lived diagonally across the street and had taken it upon herself to serve as the self-titled Neighborhood Compliance Committee officer. Her message wasn't kind. According to Janet, Gregg's porch light was excessively aggressive, disruptive to the evening ambiance, and, most curiously, a known migraine trigger. She closed with a flourish. "For the good of the community, please remove this intrusive lighting." No phone number, no suggestion of compromise, just a demand and a signature. At first, Gregg laughed. He'd lived in cities before, next to highways, train yards, even a 24-hour taco joint. And this woman was upset about a bulb that didn't break 800 lumens? But Lisa didn't laugh. She'd already heard about Janet from a neighbor, a quiet woman 2 doors down, who once got a note for excessively wind-activated garden decor. Gregg shook his head. "Let it go," he said. "We're not doing anything wrong." But by the end of the week, a real letter arrived, this one from the HOA president himself, printed on official stationery. It referenced an anonymous complaint about a porch light violating nighttime visibility guidelines. Gregg read the citation twice. It listed no specific brightness limits, just vague wording about interference with neighborly enjoyment. One more violation, it warned, and they'd face a $200 fine. Gregg was stunned. His porch light hadn't changed. Nothing had changed. Except now, somehow he was being cast as a threat to neighborhood serenity. He thought about writing back, about calling the board. But a gut feeling told him this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something more deliberate. Across the cul-de-sac, Janet's blinds shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the outline of someone watching. Gregg didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into the center ring of Janet Dillard's one-woman neighborhood crusade, and she didn't like to lose. Gregg tried to be reasonable. After the first citation, he swapped out the porch bulb for a softer, even dimmer version, an energy-efficient 40-watt equivalent with a warm hue designed for ambiance, not brightness. He adjusted the motion sensor to delay activation and pointed it more toward the ground. At night, it gave off just enough light to keep Scout from stumbling on the porch steps, nothing more. He thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Just 5 days later, the HOA board chair, Mr. Rolson, called Gregg directly. Not emailed, called. "We've received a second complaint, and it's a little unusual," he said hesitantly. "There's a photograph." Rolson forwarded it to Gregg's inbox. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A faint golden glow peeking from the bottom corner of Gregg's porch, barely registering against the night. But it was the context that was surreal. It had clearly been taken from inside someone's home, through a window, zoomed in from a distance. At 2:08 a.m. "She says it's still triggering her medical condition," Rolson added awkwardly, "and claims you're ignoring prior warnings." Gregg hadn't even turned the light on that night. The timer was off. The sensor was off. It was unplugged. But proving that, nearly impossible. He tried to explain, but Rolson offered only the classic HOA fallback. Let's try to avoid further escalation. Gregg wasn't angry yet. Not really. He was still trying to make it work. So he reached out to Janet. Polite, calm, measured. He left a note in her mailbox offering to meet halfway. He'd install a motion shield, limit use to before 10 p.m., even consider adding a privacy filter. He figured if she was really bothered by the light, they could find a compromise. Janet responded in chalk. The next morning, Gregg stepped outside to find his sidewalk covered in bright orange markings. Arrows pointed to the porch. Circles outlined where the light spilled onto the lawn. And in thick uppercase letters stretching 3 feet wide, light trespass, violation zone. Lisa was mortified. Gregg stood there for a long moment, jaw clenched, while Scout sniffed around the absurd graffiti, like it was part of some new morning ritual. That evening, Janet was back, this time with a handheld light meter and a clipboard. She paced in front of their property, stopping every few feet to jot something down, angling the sensor towards Gregg's house like she was conducting a forensic investigation. She didn't even try to hide it. Occasionally, she'd shake her head and sigh theatrically, loud enough for passing dog walkers to hear. That was the tipping point. Word spread fast. Some neighbors quietly expressed sympathy. A few, like Mrs. Linton next door, started waving more often, small acts of support that meant more than words. But most stayed quiet. They knew Janet, knew her reputation for memorizing codebooks and volunteering for rule enforcement. She wasn't officially on the HOA board, but she might as well have been their shadow president. The HOA, predictably, stayed on the fence. It's a civil disagreement, they told Gregg. Try to document everything, and we'll keep monitoring the situation. Monitoring. Gregg, a man who worked night shifts, kept his head down, and paid his dues, was now being watched like a criminal for having a porch light. And the person doing it wasn't some hired inspector or official. It was a neighbor who seemed to believe she was protecting civilization from a mid-wattage LED. That night, Gregg sat on the steps with Scout asleep beside him, watching Janet's curtains twitch open again. Something in him shifted. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't confusion anymore. It was clarity. This wasn't about a light bulb. It wasn't about migraines or codes or community standards. It was about control, and Gregg wasn't going to be controlled, not anymore. And so, for the first time since the ordeal began, Gregg didn't look away from the window. He stared straight back and began making plans. Gregg didn't shout. He didn't write letters. He didn't hold a grudge out loud. He got focused. After that morning with the chalk on his sidewalk and the clipboard stakeout, something inside him solidified. He'd spent weeks trying to be diplomatic, offering compromises, dimming lights, staying within every written rule. But Janet had made it clear she didn't want cooperation. She wanted surrender. So Gregg called someone who knew about light. His brother-in-law Tyler worked stadium and operations for a local college in Kansas City. The kind of guy who installed high-beam LED rigs that could light up entire fields from half a mile away. Gregg didn't need half a mile. He needed 50 feet, across a cul-de-sac. He explained the situation. Tyler laughed. "You want overkill?" he asked. "I've got just the thing." By Friday, a rental truck backed discreetly into Gregg's driveway with 2 commercial-grade LED floodlights, each one designed to illuminate outdoor arenas. They were large, overbuilt, professionally adjustable. Gregg spent Saturday wiring them into a dedicated switch and mounting them atop his garage with custom brackets. He angled them precisely, using a laser level and a printed diagram of the street view from Google Maps. He wasn't sloppy. He was surgical. The floodlights weren't turned on that night, or the next. Gregg wanted everything to be just right. He tested the beam alignment during the day, adjusted the coverage zone, made sure no light spilled onto anyone else's property. Just Janet's. By Sunday night, he stood in his garage with the setup complete. 2 matte gray monsters pointed squarely at her front lawn, perfectly legal, totally silent, and resting in wait. He didn't tell Lisa. He didn't need to. She simply looked at the mounted rigs and raised one eyebrow. "Finally," she said. On Monday, Gregg waited. He left the porch light off, let Janet enjoy her little victory dance for the day. He even waved at her when she checked her mail and pretended not to notice the hulking fixtures overhead. She didn't wave back. At exactly 10:01 p.m., 1 minute after the neighborhood's quiet hours began per HOA bylaws, Gregg stepped into his garage, reached for the switch, and flipped it. The effect was immediate. Janet's entire house erupted in white brilliance. Her yard looked like a stadium pre-game show. Birds exploded from nearby trees in confused spirals. Every solar light in a 4-house radius turned off, overwhelmed by the intensity. Gregg's own porch glowed like it was mid-afternoon in July. Across the street, a silhouetted figure tore open the curtains. A moment later, Janet burst through her front door in a frenzy. Wrapped in a long beige bathrobe, her hair in curlers, and her voice already raised before she hit the steps. "This is illegal," she shrieked into the night air. "Civil infraction. You're blinding me." She was waving a clipboard again, though in the spotlight it looked more like a misplaced prop. Her voice bounced off windows. Porch lights up and down the street flickered on as neighbors peeked out. Gregg, standing calmly on his front walk, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, offered her a neutral smile. "Just making sure the sidewalk's safe for everyone," he said, voice flat and even. "You never know when light trespass could strike." For a moment, Janet froze, caught in the absurdity of it all. Her own words turned back at her. Her face flushed red beneath the glow. Then she stormed back inside, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle a garden gnome. Gregg didn't keep the lights on long, just 10 minutes, enough to make the point. Then he flipped them off, went back inside, and finally, slept like a rock. Gregg didn't need to gloat. He just needed to wait. By Wednesday morning, the floodlight incident had become the most talked about event in the neighborhood WhatsApp group. And surprisingly, Gregg wasn't the one being criticized. Not even close. The HOA had received 8 formal complaints in 2 days, but not a single one was filed by Gregg. Instead, the complaints came from his neighbors, some of whom hadn't spoken up in years. There was Mr. Patel, whose fence stain had once been deemed a shade too bold by Janet's handwritten citation. The Millers, who still remembered the ordeal when Janet reported their son's 4th of July flagpole as a potential lightning hazard. And most memorably, old Mr. Farnsworth, a Vietnam veteran, who had been threatened with a noise violation over a pair of low-hanging wind chimes. Now, all of them were done staying silent. One neighbor, Lisa believed it was Mr. Erickson, the retired engineer on the corner, went a step further. He compiled a digital dossier, time-stamped phone photos, short video clips of Janet prowling with her light meter, shots of the chalk outlines on Gregg's sidewalk, and even an audio recording where she muttered about training the community to comply. He sent it directly to the full HOA board with a subject line that simply read, "Pattern of harassment, formal complaint attached." This time, the board couldn't ignore it. By Friday afternoon, an official letter was delivered to Janet's mailbox. Lisa watched it happen. An HOA board member in a navy windbreaker walked up, placed the envelope into her brass letter slot, and left without saying a word. Inside was the verdict. Our Janet Dillard was formally stripped of her self-appointed neighborhood compliance title. She was issued a cease and desist order, no more letters, no more inspections, and no more contact with residents regarding HOA violations. Any future complaints from her would be subject to board review before any action could be taken. Gregg didn't throw a party. He didn't parade around the cul-de-sac. He didn't need to. That night, just after dusk, he gave the stadium lights one final encore, a 5-minute glow across Janet's lawn, bright, theatrical, and silent. She didn't come outside, but the blinds in her upstairs window slowly closed. And that was the end of it. Gregg unmounted the floodlights that weekend and stored them in the garage. The porch went back to its soft amber glow, barely enough to read a menu by, but perfect for letting Scout find his way to the flower bed without tripping. The street grew quiet again. Lawn chairs reappeared. Neighbors waved a little more easily. As for Janet, she finally bought herself a pair of thick blackout curtains. From then on, the only spotlight on her house came from the sunset, and that suited everyone just fine. Because in the end, justice hadn't just been restored. It had been broadcast in full LED.